On Friday, I watched the virtual memorial for the victims of the shooting in Nova Scotia. Many of the sentiments were expected. Some speakers were eloquent, others less so. All were heartfelt. But there was one speaker, a pastor, who named something unexpected yet poignant. He shared how on Sunday, everyone was shocked. On Monday, everyone felt sorrow. But by Tuesday, he felt shame that someone was capable of such hatred and violence. Among the speakers, singers, and a surprising number of sportscasters, his words seemed to capture the heart of what so many of us feel. Now, there are a couple of things we can do with a feeling like shame. One is to run from it. And this is what we see in the opening lines of our gospel reading as Peter says to his friends, "I'm going fishing." Now, at first, his actions seem odd, following as they do last Sunday's reading when Jesus, the risen one, appears to the disciples. We forget that what we just heard was very likely an addendum to the original gospel. And if that's the case, then prior to this reading, the last that we heard from Peter was he and John were leaving the tomb, an empty tomb, feeling completely confused. In this case, his reaction in today's text is much more understandable. After all, he's not only witnessed the result of hatred and violence in Jesus crucified, but fearing how that hatred and violence will impact him, he has denied ever knowing Jesus. Overwhelmed by everything that happened, he's returned home, wanting to put it all behind him. He can't any more than any of us can. So no wonder that he and his friends fish all night with nothing to show for it. But, and this is the key, as morning breaks, Jesus is on the beach with breakfast. This is the alternative to running from your shame. You face the experience. We'll hear more about this next Sunday as Jesus confronts Peter and asks him 3 times whether or not he loves him. But before Peter can get to that point, he simply needs support. He needs to share a meal with friends, to know that they love him without judgment, that they are there with an ear, that they're there with a hand on his shoulder. Now, we can't give this kind of support to each other, and so we're adapting with virtual vigils and with pictures of lit candles shared on social media. But whether it's in the flesh or virtually, all we can offer in these moments is our vulnerability, our shared feelings of powerlessness in the face of trauma and tragedy. Hands open in resignation as much as wanting to help. Now, I would suggest that though we feel resigned, we still want answers. It's no wonder many of us have been glued to the TV, watching whatever news we can. We question how something like this could happen. We want to blame someone. In fact, we even want to blame God. We wonder how God could allow hatred and violence to exist. And that question presumes that God is almighty, all-powerful, in control. But in Jesus, we see the exact opposite of that energy. Jesus is born a defenseless child and a poor one at that. Throughout his life and his ministry, he taught that the reign of God is about service, about being last, about letting go for others. In his death and resurrection, we discover that God's nature is never about success. or control or might. God's nature has always been about vulnerable love. God releases power to give us free will, even if that means that free will will be abused. Love freely offered never exerts power over others. Love freely offered expresses power with others. And so while it seems that God is absent in this time, absent in the violence on this weekend, absent in the pandemic, because God isn't forcefully intervening, I'd argue that God is very much present. Present in the heartbreak, present in compassionate service, always there, respecting our freedom, sharing in love. Now, this is difficult for us because what we expect is God to be full of power, because God's seeming absence doesn't feel like power to us. We expect power to be about force. This is likely why the gunman acted like he did. He wore a uniform and he drove a police cruiser. That was more about eluding capture. His obsession with the police says a lot about his need to have authority over others, to be in control over others, especially over women. We need to remember that the start of the violence probably began with domestic assault. We claim zero tolerance about violence against women, and yet here we are. We can't ignore this aspect of the case. And yet, a Toronto Star columnist wisely notes recently that the coverage is falling into typical patterns of trying to explain the perpetrator's mental state. She argues that if he had been a person of color, with all the behaviors racked up over the years, he would have been flagged a long, long time ago. She's right. But culturally, we give way to power, especially those who have more than others. The gunman had power, even as he craved more. As I consider this, my heart echoes the feeling of shame of that pastor. There's certainly something amiss in our world and in our hearts, something that has been highlighted by the pandemic. We've heard a constant mantra about how we're all in this together, but it's clear that we're not experiencing the pandemic equally. We're seeing social and economic gaps, especially south of the border. Now, I'm sure we've heard on the news that various states want to reopen their economies. Some of our provinces do as well. What we don't hear is about how in the states the push towards opening up some areas might be a need to cut off access to unemployment insurance, forcing those already at higher risk of serious illness being further exposed to the virus. It isn't a coincidence, at least I don't think it is, that jobs held mostly by white men in suburbs have not been designated essential, but jobs filled mainly by women and by racialized people living in urban areas. Those are the jobs that are now considered essential, and people need to now go back to work. Before we get too high on our own laurels, in Canada, we may not want to reopen as quickly as they do in the States, but we have similarly high numbers of people, racialized people and women, working on the front lines, often for low pay, feeling more and more precarious as the shutdown continues. This disparity between haves and have-nots is making all of us sicker. I don't know if we realize that. Even the wealthy are harmed by income inequality. It's caused by the stress of lack of social cohesion, of the severing of community bonds. I wonder if we are applauding all the ways that we're helping each other right now, because so much of our community solidarity has been eroded over the last decades. Maybe this is where God is truly present, helping us to see how much our society has been shaped by coercive power, by who has power and who doesn't have power, and reminding us that it doesn't have to be this way, that there is an alternative. When Jesus stood on the beach, he told his friends to cast their net onto the right side, inviting them to reclaim the vision that he had first offered to them, a vision echoed by astronauts in high orbit. This world really is shared by all of us. So if that's the case, maybe we need to reshape the way we treat each other upon it. As we sit with each other in this time of grief, I pray that we will really listen to what is on each other's hearts, that we will help each other to name the shame we feel of a world that's too beholden to power. May we start to shape a world that is less about force and more open to vulnerable love, that is less about controlling others and more about loving service. This is the vision Jesus waited on the beach to share with his friends. He's waiting on the beach for us as well. Amen. So let us now take a moment of silent reflection.